Welcome back. All right, the ongoing trade war between the United States and Turkey is being blamed in part for Turkey's current economic woes, but prices are soaring. The currency is taking a nosedive there, and debt is also on the rise. Well, South Africa has suffered collateral damage as a result of this, with the plunging Turkish lira having a knock-on effect on the rand. Well, let's speak more about this, and we're joined by eNCA anchor Shahan Ramkissoon, who is in Istanbul, to explore the impact of this. So, Shahan, I keep going to this very same question I asked you yesterday. How are people in Turkey able to cope with their bond repayments, for example, when we in South Africa complain at the slightest increase of interest rates? We're currently sitting at 6.5. In Turkey, it's gone from 17.7% to 24%. How in the world are they coping?
Well, people are not happy about that in particular, but what you must remember about Turkey is that their growth, their economic growth rate is much higher than South Africa's. It was actually 5.5%. It's been revised down now to 3.8%. Poverty is not it's not as big as it is in South Africa, in Turkey, and people that we've spoken to say they actually enjoy some of the benefits of a higher dollar because they also operate in dollars in Turkey. So unlike South Africa, where we are stuck to one currency in which we can trade in and operate in within the country, Turkey is different. Some businesses here actually accept dollars, and that's how they make sure that they get a cut out of what's happening and what many would call a crisis in this country. So that's the difference here, Koli. But let's be realistic about it. Inflation is also high. Gas prices have gone up. So that's why you'll have people complaining about an increase in prices in Turkey, but they're not hopping mad. I haven't seen anyone do that or say that just yet. Yes, there are people who are unhappy with the way in which the current government has been handling the situation. They accuse President Erdogan of overspending money despite knowing that there was a looming crisis in the country and other emerging markets. And the AK party, which is the leading party in Turkey, still saying to me when I interviewed them that as far as they're concerned, they've made the right moves. They've made moves to actually ensure that the economy grows, to create employment for people so that ultimately they can live better lives. And I spoke to Cevdet Yilmaz. He's the former Deputy Prime Minister on the economy. He's also an AK party member, a senior official in the party. Let's take a listen to what he had to say when I asked him if he believes Turkey is currently in a crisis.
Our employment is increasing, our exports are increasing, so our public sector in good shape. So I wouldn't call it a crisis, but it is, of course, a problem. It's a turmoil in the financial markets, and most part of it actually related to our political relations with the US and the image created about Turkey upon these issues. So I wouldn't call it that way.
Many people will say, given that your inflation is up by 18%, which is a 15-year high, the lira crashing by 40% against the dollar is a crisis. You don't see it as that because you are putting measures in place to address it.
Actually, if you technically speaking, a recession happens when an economy have a negative growth rate for 2 consecutive quarters. We don't have such a situation in Turkey. On the contrary, as I said, in the first half of this year, Turkish economy grew more than 6%, very high growth rate. Of course, our growth rate will slow down in the second half of this year, but overall, we have actually announced our medium-term program. According to this program, this year Turkish economy will grow 3.8%, and that is quite acceptable level of growth.
All right, let's move on and talk more about the medium-term economic plan. You have revised your growth down to 3.8%, as you say, for this year and 2.3% for 2019.
That's right.
Some experts are saying, given what's happening, that's still not realistic, but you're confident about it.
Quite realistic indeed, quite realistic. When you look at our potential growth long-term growth. It is more than 4%. And if you look at our performance during AK Party governments, it is more than that. I mean, 15 years average is almost 5.5%, 6%. So quite high level of growth. So this 2.3% is an important slowdown for us. In our standards, it's an important slowdown in our growth rate. We will still have a growth, but it will be low because we call it a balancing year.
What's your take on US President Donald Trump's import tariffs and the trade wars, as people call it?
Very bad news for all of us, actually, because we have seen this in the previous century. You know, we have to remember 1930s, the Great Depression. And when you look at what happened before this Great Depression, there was similar trade wars in the world. If each and every country just considers its own narrow interest and acts in that lines, then it harms everybody.
When you address issues like this, as you mentioned, emerging market countries are affected by trade wars, etc. South Africa's rand was affected when the lira crashed as well. So there is impact on other emerging markets. Do you consider these impacts when you try to deal with the situation?
Of course, as developing world, we are somehow in the same ship. So it is important that we have this solidarity between developing countries. What we call normalization in the developed world, I mean, they are increasing the interest rate in the developed world, that affects the whole developing countries. I mean, there is a movement of dollar and euro from developing world to the developed one due to this interest hikes. That is a part of the story, but another part of the story is that in the international media, developing world is usually portrayed in a negative way, and that affects the overall image of the developing world. We have to fight together against this negative image of developing worlds. Actually, emerging markets are dynamic, and they will continue to be dynamic in the coming decades. So short-term financial turmoils should not be exaggerated, and they should not harm the perception of potential in the developing and emerging markets. And we have to work together for this.
All right, so Shahan, let's talk a little bit then about the interference of politics in an economic crisis. Very interesting developments that are happening in Argentina, where the president of the central bank resigning yesterday for personal reasons. In Turkey, you had the president, Tayyip Erdogan, somewhat instructing the central bankers there not to raise interest rates, but he was defied. It's important that these central banks are independent of politics, isn't it?
No, it definitely is important for central banks to be independent of politics. And many have argued that President Erdogan is trying to interfere. As you say, he did say that they shouldn't hike interest rates, but they did. And that basically will tell you whether or not he has any power on the central bank in Turkey. But we did speak to the former central bank governor of Turkey, and he said to us, as far as he's concerned, there is still some fluence on government's part on the central bank. He doesn't believe that the central bank here is entirely independent. So whoever you speak to in any political sphere, Koli, as you know in South Africa as well, the opposition always has theories about what's actually happening in the state and what's happening in at the central banks, for instance. And this former central bank told us he believes that the central bank is not independent, even though President Erdogan has insisted that it is an independent central bank. So we can go back and forth on who says what, and the reality, of course, will speak for itself on that regard.
eNCA anchor Shahan Ramkissoon live for us in Istanbul, keeping a watch on this eNCA special focus on emerging markets that are somewhat on the brink, if you like. Well,